welcome to all of you. Warm welcome to Amnesty International. This year we want to bring into sharp focus the human rights abuses that are being faced by some of the most vulnerable people in the world: refugees, internally displaced people, and migrants, many of whom are women and children. The world is becoming an increasingly dangerous place for people who are pushed out of their homes because of what they believe in or because of who they are. And in the case of migrants, people who are seeking to escape poverty and are looking for a life with dignity. Take the tragic example of Syria. 1.5 million people pushed out of the country as refugees, 4 million internally displaced, and the numbers are growing. But already, more than 25% of the country's population have been pushed out of their land and livelihoods.
In the face of such a bleak situation where really war crimes and gross abuses against defenseless civilians have become routine, the international community has failed spectacularly on all fronts. It has failed to bring the necessary pressure on the parties involved in the conflict, first and foremost on the Syrian government, but increasingly also on the Syrian armed opposition groups, who too, in recent months, have been committing more and more abuses. And the international community has also failed to get the desperately needed assistance and relief to those who have been displaced, whether those who remain within Syria or those who have reached the refugee camps in the neighboring countries, some of whom live in absolutely dire conditions. And with the number of refugees growing every day, the international community really needs to do more of the burden sharing.
But if we look at some of the other refugee populations, we can find, for example, the 200,000 people who had to flee Mali last year, the 140,000 Myanmar refugees in Thailand, and the 500,000 Somali refugees in Dadaab, Kenya, the world's largest refugee camp. But the biggest and oldest refugee population of all is Palestinian. Some have been displaced for more than 60 years, living for generation after generation in refugee camps. In Lebanon, tens of thousands live in overcrowded camps and face discrimination in access to employment. And there are little prospects that the next generation will not be born in the same refugee camps.
So the people who are having to flee their countries and their contexts because of conflict are clearly unprotected. But millions of migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, are also driven into abusive conditions, forced labor, even sexual abuse. And the European Union, which won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, unfortunately implements border control measures that actually sometimes put the lives of migrants and asylum seekers at risk.
We see a lot of scaremongering about the number of refugees in Europe, about how cities and services will be unable to cope. But let's look at the numbers. In the past few months, every single day, 2,000 refugees have entered Jordan. And this is a country with only 6 million people. There are more than 15 million refugees in the world, and most are in developing countries. Yet, only 80,000 are resettled every year, half what the UN says is needed. The European Union takes only 5,500 people every year. The story of refugees and migrants is a story of politics. They do not vote, they have no wealth and no status. They are an easy scapegoat for economic and social problems. Blaming migrants and asylum seekers is a refuge of governments who do not have the courage to take responsibility for their failures.
So what are we calling for today? Number one, we are calling for national governments to take their responsibility to protect the rights of every human being, which includes migrants, refugees, internally displaced people. And this means putting in place policies, laws, and institutions that protect and respect the rights of all. It also means national leaders have to challenge attitudes that scapegoat refugees, immigrants, and displaced persons. Those abused must have and effective access to justice. Immigration detention centers can only be a last resort and cannot include children. So that's our first call. The second, to the international community at the more global level, the UN Security Council and global leaders of the most powerful countries in the world have to consistently stand up to repressive governments that hide behind national sovereignty. Human rights cannot stop at national borders. There can be no firewalls in the global demand for human rights. And finally, there has to be a reordering of the burden sharing in relation to refugees. The sad reality is that the majority of refugees in the world today are actually hosted for and taken care of by some of the poorest countries in the world. So the richest countries meet in various conferences and make all sorts of pledges. We've seen this in Afghanistan, we've seen this now in Syria, but they never actually keep their commitment. So in closing, I'd just like to remind you that human rights protection applies to all human beings, whether at home or not. People's rights cannot be trampled on because they cross a border.
Thank you, Salil. It is a great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce to you Chen Guangcheng, whose life of activism was in the world headlines last year. It's a particular honor to welcome him here today.
世界发展到今天，应该有一个新的起源。我在这儿借用一句话，就是咱们国际特赦创始人当时的那种想法：与其我们在这儿诅咒黑暗，不如去点燃蜡烛。所以我们现在就用实际行动来改变这一切，改变整个世界的这种不公与残暴。
I think the human rights is now facing a new start, and today I want to cite the motto of Amnesty International, which is, it is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And what we should do is to take real actions and to fight for human rights.
谢谢大家，让我们一起努力。
Thank you, and let's do it together.
谢谢。